Well, now that we have the marginal cost and the average variable cost, let's try to go ahead and fill in the rest of this table. Now, as we found with marginal cost and average variable cost, there is more than one way to find these numbers, with the exception of fixed cost, average fixed cost. Average fixed cost, if you notice down here at the bottom of that column, I put in the formula for fixed cost. Average fixed cost is always the fixed cost divided by the output. Q stands for output here. There's no other way to do that. That's what it is. But for average total cost, there's more than one way of getting it, so we'll explore that when we get there. Both of the ways of finding average total cost require finding something to do with fixed cost. Now, of course, at the top of the table here, we had before the wage was $2,500 and the fixed cost was $5,000, and I have now gone ahead, the difference between this and the previous video, I've went ahead in between the videos and just highlighted those in green so you can kind of see that's where the money is coming from. So we can now start finding average fixed cost. Now, other thing I've done is I've also demonstrated for you here that you can find the variable cost. And again, the reason why you might need the variable cost is if you want to find the change in the variable cost, to divide that by the change in output to get the marginal cost, because you don't have the marginal cost already filled in. It might be handy to have the variable cost. So I've already done that here. I found out what those were. So let me show you that the different variable costs are here. Variable cost is simply the wage times the amount of labor. So for example, if you got 2 workers, it's 5,000 because you get 2 workers, you're paying them each 2,500. If you got 4 workers, it's 10,000 and so on. So to have really the complete table, you might want that. Obviously, you don't have to fill that out if you're asked on an exam or something like that to fill in just the cost numbers here. You don't have to have that, but it might be handy to realize that that's a possibility. And so I put it up here, and you can pause the video, look at it to make sure you understand where all those numbers come from. But basically, the wage here, this wage 2,500 times the amount of labor, which is the input. The other thing that we will maybe want is the total cost, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first, let's find the average fixed cost because you're told to find that on the table. So the average fixed cost is very straightforward compared to everything else. It's basically take this fixed cost, which is $5,000, and divide it by the amount of output. So you don't need anything at all to do with input, which I hope makes sense. If you have a fixed cost, it doesn't matter how much input you use. The fixed cost doesn't care about input. The only input you got is your fixed input. So in the short run, when you change your short run variable input, the fixed cost doesn't change. The only thing that does change is the average fixed cost, because you're taking that fixed cost and you're dividing it out over a different amount of output as you change the output. So that's the only thing that changes about the average fixed cost, not the fixed cost part, but the output part. And so, for example, to get this average fixed cost right here, the first one here, obviously if you have 0 output, it's kind of undefined. But if you have this, if you want to find this average fixed cost of making 501 units of output, what you do is you take the $5,000 fixed cost and you divide it by 501. And the answer you get is 9.98. $5,000 divided by 501. Now that just happens by accident to be equal to these. So that there's nothing about that that means that it should always be the same. It just happens to by accident be the same. It's a coincidence. It's 100% coincidence. It's because the fixed cost is twice as big as the wage, and the first line of the table here has 2 inputs, so that's the whole reason. So don't worry about that. But take the fixed cost divided by the output for the next line of the table. So you're taking the fixed cost of $5,000. You're going to divide it by $1,846, and that's going to give you 2.70 0.086 as your average fixed cost of making 1,846 units of output. Your average fixed cost is 2.7086. When you're making 3,922 units of output on this line of the table here, then your average fixed cost is 5,000 divided by 3,922. So that's going to give you 1.2749. When you're making 6,611 units of output, your average fixed cost is then going to be 5,000 divided by 6,611. And that's going to give you 0.7563. When you are making 9,800 units of output and you want to find the average fixed cost, you simply take $5,000, you divide it by 9,800, and you get 0.5102. And we can pick here anywhere on the table. If you're making 3,800 units of output, or 38,000 units of output, excuse me, you take the 5,000 divided by 38,000, and you're going to get 0.1316. So as you're doing that math, you will discover for all of these that the average fixed cost is going down as you make more units of output because you're dividing this $5,000 by bigger amounts of output, because that's what the formula is. Now, to find the average total cost, there are two ways of getting the average total cost. As you see here, average total cost is either the total cost divided by the output, or it's the average fixed cost plus the average variable cost. Now, all of these numbers for average fixed cost are rounded off, and all of these numbers for average variable cost, pretty much, I think for a couple of them, are rounded off as well. So if you do the formula for average total cost where you're adding the average fixed cost together to the average variable cost, bear in mind that you might get a slightly different off answer because you're adding together two numbers that have been rounded. And if you actually round your numbers more than these in this table, then that error that you're introducing is going to be even bigger. Just bear that in mind. It's not probably going to be enough to have you get the wrong answer on an exam question or something like that. But it's still something that you should bear in mind as you're doing these calculations and looking at this. The average total cost. Let's look at both of the ways of getting the average total cost. Now, one of the ways of getting the average total cost is to take the total cost and divide it by the output. Now, how do you get the total cost? Well, part of the total cost is a fixed cost. That's pretty easy. And another part of the total cost would be the variable cost. The variable cost we've already got here, right? The variable cost is the wage times the amount of labor. So, for example, if you wanted to get the total cost when you're making 501 units of output, what you do is you take the $5,000 fixed cost, you add it to the $5,000 variable cost, and it turns out what you'd get here would be $10,000. I've gone ahead and filled in all those total cost numbers for you just for reference. Now, you don't have to do this, but if you have not already filled in these other costs, if you haven't already filled in the table, the marginal product, the average product, the marginal cost, and the average variable cost, this might be an easier way to find the average total cost. Take $10,000 and divide it by your output, because that's what total cost divided by output would be. That's average total cost. So take $10,000, which is your total cost, the $5,000 fixed cost, plus the $5,000 variable cost, add the others $10,000. Take that $10,000 divided by 501, and you'd get 19.9601. That's, by the way, you notice, that's what you get if you don't round off. That's actually taking the total cost and not rounding it off. If you added these two together, then obviously that 0.01 thing, the 9601, the 01 part would go away if you just add these together. The other way of getting it is to take the average fixed cost plus average variable cost. That's to take this plus add it to that, and that will give you this without that one at the end. So you see, you get pretty much the same answer with rounding error if you take the average variable cost plus the average fixed cost, add them together, or if you take the total cost of $10,000 and divide it by 501 output. Either way, you get the answer. To get the average total cost for the next line on the table, what would you do? Well, take your total cost, $15,000, because that's the $10,000 variable cost plus the $5,000 fixed cost. That gives you $15,000 total cost, and divide it by 1,846. If you did that, and I believe the number on this table is doing that directly, you get 8.1256. If on the other hand, 27, excuse me. If on the other hand you added together the average fixed cost plus the average variable cost, you could do that, do that on a calculator. You'd get the same answer. So one way to do it, take the average variable cost, add together the average fixed cost, that'll give you the average total cost. On the other hand, if you take the $15,000 fixed cost, divide that by 1,846, that would give you the same answer. To get the average total cost, the next line on the table, that is when output is 3,922, you could take the total cost, which is now at that line of the table, $20,000. How did I get that? I took the fixed cost of $5,000, added to the variable cost of $15,000, because you got 6 workers, you're each paying them $2,500. And that gives you $20,000 total cost. Take $20,000 total cost divided by the output of 3,922, and you're going to get 5.0994. You could also add this average variable cost, which is 3.8246, and you could add it to 1.2749. But because these are rounded off, that's why you're going to get a slight discrepancy here. If you notice, the last digit would be a 5 instead of a 4 as it is. So adding these rounded off numbers together, you get a slightly different answer, but it's good enough. You could recognize it. It's, basically $5.10 when you round off the dollars and cents. The next line of the table, you could take the total cost, which is $25,000, divided by 6,611. I'm not going to explain how to get $25,000 because we already went through that enough, but you're basically taking the variable cost plus the fixed cost. And then you divide that by the 6,611. If you did that, then the answer you'd get would be 3.7816. The other way of getting that would be to add the average variable cost of 3.0256 to the average fixed cost of 0.7563, and you get the same answer. So again, if you've already figured out this part of the table, this column and this column of the table, then go ahead and just add them together. But if you haven't done that, a shorter way of finding the average total cost might be to take the total cost and divide it by the output. So for example, if you jump down here, take the total cost divided by the output, well, you got 27 workers, multiply that by $2,500, right? And you got $67,500 as your variable cost. Add that to the $5,000 fixed cost, you get $72,500. Divide that by the output of 40,781 units of output, and you get 1.7778. That's the same as if you added together the average variable cost plus the average fixed cost together, gives you the same answer. So there's 2 ways of getting the average total cost. Let me throw in here all of the answers so that if you want, you can look over the table and make sure that on your own calculation you get these numbers for the average total cost. Pause the video and do that if you want to do it. But I just want to demonstrate for you that's how you get these cost numbers that we come up with in Chapter 10.